Welcome to Face the State. I'm Ariana Bennett. Thank you for joining us. Well, it seems like every time we turn around, there's a new national figure being accused of sexual misconduct. Now, there's been a lot of outrage, but also a lot of confusion about where the line is drawn between normal interaction and really what's inappropriate behavior. So, marriage and family therapist Stephen Ng is here now to talk about all of that. Stephen, thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. So, we're talking sexual harassment, and it's a bit of a fuzzy term. How do we even define what that is?
The confusion is quite understandable because of that term. It doesn't come trippingly to the tongue. We don't use it in casual everyday conversation. And although there are many legal nuances to this term, especially in workplace sexual harassment cases, I think for all of us, what's going to work is something very simple. Simply any unwanted sexual attention.
The problem therein is, how do you know it's unwanted? And we're seeing this a lot with these stories from very public people saying, well, I thought it was consensual. I thought she was interested.
Right, and that is a problem. And the answer isn't being more precise in statute, or certainly with not my being more precise in this television program, because that's not going to change anybody's behavior. But the problem is that men grow up from being boys who were never taught how to distinguish between what is consent and what is not consent. And in fact, if we're on that subject, it goes back further to our pervasive dearth of social skills. Men in general aren't talking to people. Boys aren't talking to people. They're watching their cell phones, they're playing video games, they're not even playing games outdoors with other boys. So these individuals grow up with terrible social skills, but that doesn't explain somebody like Charlie Rose, who's a man in his 70s and by all accounts brilliant and accomplished and truly a good person, but his behavior when it comes to sexuality at least is remarkably childish. So how do we explain that? And I think genuinely it goes back to the fact that we as a culture and as a nation have an extremely difficult time talking about sexuality in general, which is reflected, of course, in our school system. But we also, since we can't talk about sexuality, how are we ever going to teach boys what sexual consent would be? I think that makes it extremely difficult for those boys to grow up and to become men who would ever even know that. The time-honored test for every 12-year-old or 13-year-old boy who's been on a date is you go to the movie theater and you find out if it's okay for you to put your arm around her by putting your arm around her. And the same thing with the first kiss and all the rest. And really what we're talking about there is determining consent by the Braille method. So I've got to kind of touch my way into it until I meet with some real resistance. And then what if that resistance is only token or only mild, and I try again and the resistance fades? Now I'm learning that I need to keep up the pressure because surely she'll come around. And I think if we're not going to teach 12 and 13-year-old boys how to say something like, I'd really like to hold your hand, would that be okay? If we're not going to teach them how to say that, I don't think we can, in all fairness, expect them to generate that on their own. I've had this conversation with other adult men who make fun of liberal snowflakes and that kind of thing. Really, we're going to have to ask permission for every single stage of the engagement. And of course, can I hold your left hand? Can I hold your right hand? No, of course, that's ridiculous and silly. But we could learn to say things like, I'm a person who's pretty comfortable with affection. Would it be okay if I held your hand and gave you a hug from time to time? And I think women then have an option, or if she's saying it first, he has an option of saying, I'm really not ready for that right now, maybe later. And then, boy, it's perfectly clear. Nobody risked any ego. Nobody had to get their boundaries violated. And I really don't think we can say then that he has made the sexual attention unwanted because he hasn't offered it.
I guess it's the making the assumptions that is the problem. And I think I can fairly say definitively that those conversations are not happening. They are definitely not the norm, and I would venture to say highly unusual.
Right. I mean, we as a society still haven't figured out, I think, even basic science facts like, is there such a thing as people being born gay, or is that really a lifestyle choice? And for our trans citizens, are they making a lifestyle choice as well, or is that really something that is innate from birth on? Because otherwise, we're thinking it's what, a style, a fashion. It's I just got so tired of being a man and having a penis. I think I can say that on the air. It's not a swear word. It's a medical term. But I don't think people think that way. I don't think people have choices about sexual orientation or their sexual identity. They simply are what they are.
Well, I think it's safe to say that the conversations are definitely not happening in, at least in as much detail, with as much frequency as maybe we would need to in order to make it a commonplace thing. And I think what is happening, and this would be hard to deny, is that anytime you throw human beings together, there's going to be some kind of sexually charged interaction. And I think that, especially like workplace policies, for example, that say none of that, are doomed to fail.
I couldn't agree more. So I'm wondering if you've been bugging my office because I say the same darn thing. Any attempt we have to repress human sexuality is doomed to failure, because our sexuality is really the most portable part of who we are. We take it with us wherever we are and whatever it is we're doing, whether we're at work or recreating or just simply sitting at home by ourselves. So in the workplace, yes, there's always going to be sexuality. And that's really what I like about this definition of any sexual attention that makes someone feel uncomfortable, because just as we are all sexual beings, we are also all different. That's one of the things we all have in common, is that we're all different. And so sexual joking or innuendo with one person that's perfectly acceptable might make another person very uncomfortable. And we need to be aware of that. And that's just part of interacting with each other in a respectful way.
Now, given that this is, very widespread on all levels, why is it, do you think, that now we seem to be experiencing this huge onslaught of public reporting of, big national names? It just seems like it's constant.
I think there are a couple of reasons. I think one is we've been set up for a wonderful exchange of information with the invention of the internet. And so things are easy. It's easier for every one of us to get our story out there. And frankly, I appreciate that. I think it's going to make it our better world for our having those conversations. But we had a special catalyst, I think, this last year, and in the form of a national election. And I think a lot of women were appalled when we elected someone who had so many allegations of sexual impropriety. And I think that's translated into some real desire to do something about it, to stop sitting on the sidelines, to stop being passive, but to instead speak up. And I think that's really doing all of us, men and women, a real service.
In a lot of these cases, too, we're seeing women specifically coming forward many years after the incident happened, in some cases decades after the incident happened. Do you think that in any way that delegitimizes their case?
The short answer is no. And the longer answer, and I hope people continue to listen for the longer answer, is I've worked with so many people with sexual issues over the last 2 decades, and all of them, male and female, they all report a pattern of being extremely embarrassed and ashamed, not of anything they did, but being ashamed because this adult person touched them in a way that is totally unacceptable. And they somehow irrationally carry a sense of responsibility for that. And then when they don't speak up the first opportunity, now they're carrying the secret. And now they're collaborating with their abuser. So whether it's a 14-year-old in Alabama, or it's an adult woman, or a much younger child, or boy, or male for that matter, it doesn't delegitimize your experience for the fact that you were so uncomfortable with it, you didn't have the words to begin talking about it. And indeed, how could they have the words? It's not something we train our children to talk about. Even myself as an adult, I think I would have a hard time talking about being sexually assaulted. It's not something that I'm familiar with. And you know, I'm sorry for those who have gone through these kinds of experiences, but I'm so grateful to them for speaking out because they're teaching us how to begin having this conversation. We need to keep it up, though.
So what would your counsel be to someone who is in this position, have had some kind of experience, whether it was when they were a child or as an adult or recently, a long time ago? What do you tell those people?
Well, you know, by the time they're in my life, and I think I can say this even to our viewers, is that if you're still uncomfortable and you're still struggling, I think one of the great things you can do if you have the privacy that will allow you to do it is to simply write out your story. Get out a piece of paper and write it out if you can, or you know, seal it under a password or whatever you need to do to maintain your privacy, but just to get it out of your head a little bit in the anonymity of your own private space. And then to ponder whether you need to do more, because I think all of us, you know, we know from science that there are certain genes in the brain that don't get activated until we engage in social conduct. And until we usually are able to tell our story to at least one other person, we never begin to arrive at that place where we actually have mastery over our story, where we have our stories instead of our stories having us. So I like to see people start with writing, and then, but quite often I meet them before they did that. And if they can come to my office and talk, or to their therapist's office and talk about it, that's fantastic. It's important for them to find a safe person, though. And of course, before God created therapists, there were friends. And sometimes our friends are the most important people we could begin this conversation with, because they can be very affirming. And we have to use wisdom with that, because sometimes our friends themselves, they struggle with these feelings and these experiences as well. Although, I have to say, generally speaking, we almost all have 20/20 vision when it comes to someone else. So something that I might find very difficult to forgive in myself, I can have a lot of compassion for somebody else. And I still think friends would be a good place to start as well.
Absolutely. Okay, well, that is a perfect point for us to take a quick break with Stephen. Sit tight. Coming up on Face the State, I will be back with Stephen to talk about the solutions to this problem, how we prevent sexual misconduct from happening in our workplaces, our schools, and everywhere else. Stay with us.